Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 11th Annual Health Experience Design Conference. I'm Amy Heymans, co-founder and chief experience officer of MadPow and founder of this conference. At HXD, we focus on improving the experience of health through design and innovation. And over the past 11 years, we have come so far. We're so grateful to everyone who has joined us along this journey, making HXD what it is today. And we're so grateful to you for joining us here right now. This past year has been a difficult one for everyone in ways large and small. But I'm so inspired on a daily basis by all of the dedication, hard work, ideas, generosity, and selflessness I've borne witness to across our community. The heroic work of healthcare workers, the tireless efforts of the scientists who brought us the vaccine, and the efforts that each one of you focused on helping people to get through this crisis as successfully as possible. I am truly, truly grateful to each and every one of you for everything that you've done. We have worked so hard. This year, we have an amazing, amazing lineup of speakers from across the health ecosystem who are going to give us the information and inspiration that we need to keep doing the important work that we're doing. We'll dive into futures thinking, behavior change design, implementation science, diversity, equity, and inclusion, person-centered care, digital health, and how to accelerate and scale innovation, and a whole lot more. To start out, I want to introduce you to a personal hero of mine, Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Sanjay is the multiple Emmy Award winning chief medical correspondent for CNN, and he's also a practicing neurosurgeon. You may recognize him from the series Chasing Life, where he travels the world in search of the secrets to living longer, happier, healthier lives, or from the documentary One Nation Under Stress, where he examines why life expectancy is declining in the United States. He's also published many books, including his latest, Keep Sharp, which is a guide for keeping your brain young, healthy, and sharp. When I hear him speak, I've been known to shout, "Yes!" or "Amen, brother." He is truly a luminary, and he gives people both the knowledge and inspiration to live healthier lives. Without further ado, I'm so excited to welcome to the HXD stage Dr. Sanjay Gupta.
Hey, thank you, Amy. That was a very nice introduction. I appreciate that, and so honored to be here. Amy and I had a chance to talk a couple of weeks ago, and I really enjoyed the chat, and I'm very much looking forward to being with you and all of you today.
Yes, yes, it's so good to talk with you. I love it when, famous people are just normal, friendly people when you meet them. It's wonderful. So there's so much I'd like to cover with you. Love to talk for 2 days, but let's get right into it. You actually have been in the thick of reporting on the pandemic since it started. I wonder what you think about where we are now and what your thoughts are on why the United States was so adversely affected when compared with other countries.
Yeah, well, it's been quite a year. I think that goes without saying. Everyone who's watching, obviously, this has been a year that's been transformative in so many ways. I think that, as I look at things now, I am optimistic about where we will be going over the next several weeks and months. I think there's a bunch of different factors that go into that. I think the fact that we have 3 authorized vaccines, that's an incredible thing. I know people realize that, but it can take years, if not decades, to create a vaccine if you are successful at all. We still don't have a vaccine for HIV/AIDS after 4 decades. So that's I think, cause for a significant amount of optimism. Add into that the fact that the weather is getting warmer and the virus doesn't spread as well in the warmer months. I think also gives you some optimism. So I think going into the summer, we're going to be in a much better position than we are now. but we're still sort of seeing numbers go up in various places around the country. People are becoming infected still, and sometimes are becoming infected with these variants, these new viruses that have slight mutations on them. And while older people and vulnerable people are increasingly largely protected, younger people are getting infected more than they were before, and sometimes, less often, but sometimes getting quite sick, even requiring hospitalization. So that's where we are. I'm optimistic, but we're not done yet as well. And I think that it's one of these things we've seen throughout where science is amazing and it can help rescue us, but our own personal behaviors and how much we lean into those behaviors are ultimately what wins the day and expedites how quickly we go into things. So it's been a hard year. I think we are going to have cause for some sense of relief and feelings of normalcy over the next few months, but it's still going to require some work.
Indeed, indeed. And there was just big news about everybody over age of 16 or 18 being able to be vaccinated soon across the United States, right? Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is just happening today, in fact. So if you remember, when President Biden, the new administration took office, they said our goal is 100 million shots in 100 days, which was a laudable goal, although they were able to quickly surpass that, and now we're at over 3 million shots on average per day. What we're seeing now is that the administration came out and said by April 19th that they are recommending that every state basically fully open eligibility for the vaccine. Anybody over the age of 16, 16 is the youngest that people can get. That's the youngest that the vaccine was trialed. But anyone over that age could get the vaccine. They're recommending after April 19th. And it's really interesting, Amy. I think part of the reason is because we are really, ramping up the vaccination efforts. But I think there's also a different sort of thing driving this, which is fascinating. I've been reporting on this, talking to a lot of people who are involved with the federal government's rollout plan, and there's this, I guess, concern to some extent that as numbers improve, as the number of people who are hospitalized, the number of people who are sadly dying improves, there was always a concern about vaccine hesitancy, but now there would be a concern about vaccine fade. And that's basically this idea that, hey, do I still really need to get the vaccine? I'm not at risk. I'm not particularly old, or I'm relatively healthy. Do I really need this? And that's a concern because people like that can oftentimes still be carriers. They can still be transmitting the virus. They can, in certain situations, become ill themselves still. So I think part of the reason that they're advancing the overall eligibility is to just basically say, hey, look, get vaccinated. Do it this spring. If you do it this spring, two things. One is that we are likely to go into this idea of herd immunity as we go into the summer, but also as we go into the fall, we're far less likely to have resurgences. The numbers are possibly going to increase again in the fall and the winter as the weather gets cooler, but hopefully they're not increasing to the point where they're not manageable, where they can be contained. And if people get vaccinated earlier, the hope is that we're much more likely to achieve that goal. So that's the big news. It means that the vaccine manufacturers, the vaccinators, the big stadium vaccination sites, you're likely to see a lot more of that over the next few weeks and months in order to get the maximum number of people vaccinated as possible.
Yeah, it's so important, and we're actually going to be covering the rush to vaccinate, the race to vaccinate as many people as possible, as well as vaccine hesitancy at this conference. It's so important. And you mentioned that good overall health is protective in general from disease, but also pandemics. So we've always discussed at this conference, well-being as the foundation for health, because we know the majority of disease is preventable and some diseases even reversible. In your latest book, you talk about how lifestyle behaviors make a huge impact in overall health, as well as in brain health specifically. Now, I know every person is different, of course, but what do you think are the most important behaviors for us to focus on in our work at health organizations, trying to help improve the health experience for others, as well as for ourselves too?
Yeah. Well, as you're asking this question, I'm realizing I didn't fully answer your first question, which is because I think this relates to it. Why did the United States get so adversely? Why was the United States so adversely affected by this? Which I think is such an important question that you raise, and I think it sort of it has to do with what you're asking now about our overall health. There's lots of reasons why the United States was the most adversely affected. I will preface by saying that there's all these exercises that go on around the world, looking at a country's sort of response, what they're capable of responding to when it comes to pandemic, and scoring it. And in fact, before this pandemic, the United States scored the highest. They had the highest pandemic response scoring, meaning that, based on resources and overall wealth of the country and public health, all that sort of stuff, the United States should have been a leader in terms of our response. And as you correctly point out, we were tremendously adversely affected. I mean, we're not even 5% of the world's population. And at various times, we had 20 to 25% of the world's new coronavirus infections. I think there's a couple things. One is that, sort of more philosophically speaking, I think we have become a society in the United States and other wealthy countries as well, where we kind of wait for science to rescue us. We will focus more on, a pill, an operation, some sort of therapeutic, as opposed to the good, healthy behaviors, because we've had that option, the convenient option, the one that requires hardly any work. You just pop a pill. And that becomes a culture, Amy, that it's a little bit hard to describe. We want the home run, we want the knockout, we want the touchdown. We don't want the single base hits as much. That's is that a waste of time? Is that, why do I need to bother myself with that? And that hubris, I think, can really get in the way. We saw the same thing, by the way, 100 years ago during the flu pandemic of 1918, 1919. The same sort of thing in the United States. There were parts of the country that simply believed, hey, look, we're the United States. We can weather this. We don't have to do all these basic public health practices. And that adversely affected us. But the second thing, I think, to your question, the matrix, the overall substrate of the country is not a very healthy country compared to places around the world. 30% of the country now is classified as either severely overweight or obese. 30%. And we knew obesity was a tremendous risk factor for this particular disease of COVID. When you start to look at the overall health of the country, you couple that with this idea that we did not lean into basic public health practices, that ends up being a real sort of prescription, I think, for being really adversely affected. I think the lessons are clear here. What I don't know is how well we will have learned those lessons and be able to lean into the basics next time. I'm optimistic about it because I look at other countries around the world, like Hong Kong, for example. They got very hit by SARS back in 2003. And when this new coronavirus, this novel coronavirus started to percolate, they immediately went into aggressive public health practice containment mode, and it made a huge difference. Hopefully we will learn those lessons, because I think if you hear anything from all these epidemiologists, you hear this idea that there will be another pandemic in our lifetime. This will happen again. And it doesn't have to be the black swan event that this pandemic seemed to be. We could contain it much more easily, much more quickly, and make it more on a blip on the radar as opposed to a huge societal transformative event.
Yeah, and I mean, there are so many lifestyle behaviors that we look at changing, right? We look at diet, we look at exercise, we look at sleep and mood and all of these things. It's hard for people to figure out, where to start and what to do next. And, that's why many in this community are designing the digital health tools and therapeutics and programs and outreach and campaigns to sort of help people to get on the right track and empower them. But it is hard for people to sort through all this information. There's competing health information around what diet is best and what should you do. I wonder if you find yourself often debunking any myths with relation to health information. Does that ever happen to you?
I think it's something that I kind of do have to do all the time in some ways. which makes it challenging because as you're trying to try and provide people with good health knowledge, accessible knowledge that will make a difference in their lives, you find yourself, I think, certainly as a medical reporter, as a physician reporter, spending at least half your time clearing out bad information first. And that's, that it's important to do because I think 90% of the journey towards good health information nowadays is making sure you get rid of the bad information to start. Get rid of those bad sort of those bad assumptions, things that this bad information is predicated on. Make sure you're getting rid of that and explaining things well. But I'll say something generally, which I think has really informed me in terms of how I look at this. There's all sorts of specifics in terms of how you should tell people to approach the way that they nourish their bodies, the way that they move their bodies, the way that they rest their bodies. And I choose those words deliberately: nourish your body versus diet, move your body versus exercise, and even rest versus sleep, because it is how we live. That is how we think about ourselves. We don't think about these procedural things. I now need to eat a certain number of calories of a certain type of diet. I got to figure out what the right nourishment is for me, this person, this human body, versus the next person, based on who I am, what I do, the kind of life that I lead. And that's, we're all individuals. But I think one of the great fallacies, Amy, and again, it took me a long time to sort of arrive at this, in terms of how I help educate my own patients or talk to people on television. And that is that I think there's always this belief that I have to engage in these healthy behaviors and I'm not particularly going to enjoy it. It's hard. And it, I have to sacrifice in some way to get to that point. We know two things. First of all, it's not that hard. In fact, it's probably a lot easier than what you're currently doing in the pursuit of good health. The human body is actually quite good at taking care of itself if sometimes we just get out of the way and don't try and force unnatural things on it. But the other thing is that we often think of adopting good, healthy practices for the distant future. I do these things so I can live longer, live a longer and more functional life near the end. But what you come to realize, and this is, I think, really informed even this current book that I wrote, Keep Sharp, is that it can feel good right now. Doing and abiding by good, healthy practices isn't just about the future. Doing those things feels good now. It's a kind of closing of the loop, if that makes sense. I think it was always difficult for people to close the loop. So, doctor, you're asking me to eat right and exercise and do all these healthy things. And then what? Nothing happens to me? That's not the most inspiring message. But if I tell you that you do these things and you're going to feel better, you're going to be a better spouse, a better son, better daughter, better friend, better coworker, all these types of things, close the loop for people. Don't just tell them to do healthy things as a punishment that they have to endure in order to live longer at the end of their lives. Tell them what it's going to do for you now. So I'll just pick one: rest. Why do we sleep? Why do we rest the way that we do? What is actually happening in the brain? Reminding people that is a time when actually your brain can be quite metabolically active, and that all the wonderful experiences you've had today or this week or this month, it is during that rest period where the brain starts to consolidate those things into memories, starts to create the movie track of your life, the thing that you reflect on years down the road and remember fondly about these experiences. It helps clear out waste from your brain at that time. The waste is always being cleared out of your brain all day long, but during rest is when that process is most efficient. And you feel good as a result. Yes, it lowers your risk for diseases like dementia later on down the road. But yes, it feels good now. You're more productive, you're happier, you're more likely to find joy in simple things. It is fascinating when you really start to dig into this research. I'm not just spouting off anecdotes here. There is real research behind what I'm saying, this idea that doing good feels good.
I got to tell you, you and I were joking about opening this session with a dance party. I may have had a private dance party before our interview to get up my energy and make my brain work well for this interview. And it definitely works. I love the words too about nourishing and nurturing and resting. So inspiring. I wonder, I love to travel, and you did a lot of traveling with your series, Chasing Health. I'm wondering what your favorite learning was from how other cultures live healthy. I mean, ideally, we'd sort of live life awesome and we'd be running along, having a great time, and then just sort of fall over, right? I'm just so curious what you learned in doing that series.
Well, first of all, it was a tremendous privilege to work on a series like that. I mean, the basic idea talking to all these the producers was, let's go to these places around the world where people are living these extraordinary lives and try and learn from them. We want to go to places where we think they're doing things that are transferable. They're not so unique to a place that, hey, look, that's great for them, but I would never work here in the United States, or things like that. But also defining, just spending time defining what is a good life. I mean, people oftentimes use longevity as the measure because it's an easy thing to measure, a long life. But that's, I think most people, I imagine, especially in this audience, would agree that that's not the only metric. I mean, you want to live a long, you want to live a functional, you want to live a happy life, you want to have a life full of meaningful connection with people. So it was a privilege to do, and I got to visit these places around the world. One of the places that ended up having a outsized impact on me, and I think maybe I would list it as one of my favorites as a result, was actually going to Bolivia and essentially living with the Chimani indigenous tribe in Bolivia in the middle of the Amazon rainforest for a period of time. Now, the reason I had decided to do that was because I had read this little article about a group of people who were thought to have, and this was in the article, the healthiest hearts in the world. The healthiest hearts in the world. And I thought, well, that's an extraordinary thing to say, the healthiest hearts in the world. Again, you'd think, well, wouldn't it be a place like the United States because we have stenting and we have cardiac bypass surgery, we have statin drugs, we have all these things. But of course, that's not the case, right? That's all to treat disease or to try and prevent disease from progressing. This was a tribe of people who were thought to essentially have no heart disease. My family, I have heart disease. My father had heart disease. I worry about heart disease all the time. How could it be that a society of people has no heart disease? I thought everyone was sort of preordained to develop some heart disease. So anyways, I flew to Bolivia. I flew to La Paz, Bolivia, which incidentally is the highest altitude-wise capital city in the world. When you're getting off the plane there, they will give you oxygen, because you're at such high altitude. And from La Paz, eventually I flew via a small plane to Rurrenabaque, which is right on the edge of the Amazon rainforest. And then we drove as far as we could into the forest in these 4x4 vehicles until we could drive no more. And then we got in canoes and just basically drifted down these estuaries and rivers in search of the Chimane tribe. And which was just an extraordinary experience. I mean, it was harrowing at times because we didn't know, it was a totally different environment. We didn't know if we were going to find them for certain or not. But eventually we found an encampment of people who were part of the Chimane. And there's all these encampments around, this area of Bolivia. And we basically, they don't speak English, obviously. They don't speak Spanish. They speak Chimane. So we had to translate everything 3 ways. I'm probably giving you way more information than you care to know, but it was just so fascinating, the whole process. But the bottom line was, I wanted to find out, why did they have the healthiest hearts in the world? These researchers had sort of documented this. How was it possible? And what you find, going back to the things that we were just talking about, the big 3, the movement, the nourishment, and the rest, you find a very specific sort of lifestyle. First of all, with regard to movement, you found that the Chimane, a hunter-gatherer sort of population of people, were active, but they weren't intensely active. They didn't tend to run, for example. They walked a lot, and they hardly ever sat. They either were lying and sleeping, or they were standing and walking. That was their movement. It wasn't about going to the gym for an hour a day and then sitting or lying for 23 hours a day. It was just about natural movements. And it was just consistent. And the only people who you really ever saw sitting among the Chimane were really old people who were nearing the end of their lives. And it was almost like the sitting was sending a signal to their bodies that, your time is coming, as opposed to I'm going to sit all the time and signal to my body that my time is coming. So movement, but not intense movement. Rest wise, it was interesting. As you imagine, no devices or anything worked out there, right? So they had none of these to stare at as you're trying to go to sleep. So as a result, I set up my little tent there in the encampment around 9:30 at night after the sun went down. I was in my tent and you'd start to hear snoring. You'd start to hear heavy breathing around. And about 6:30 in the morning, with the call of the rooster in the rainforest, you'd hear people start to wake up. So people were getting good sleep, 9 hours of sleep, 8 to 9 hours regularly, just mainly because they weren't staring at screens. As far as their diet goes, it was a true hunter-gatherer diet. They're eating off the land. They eat protein. They eat, it's a lot of vegetables. They tend to farm a lot of food because if you're living off the land, farming you can count on. You may have bad hunting days, but farming you can count on. So a lot of their diet just revolved around carbs, but not processed carbs, real carbs that come from the ground. So, it was just fascinating to see that kind of lifestyle essentially could lead to no heart disease. They don't even have a healthcare system there, Amy. We spend billions of dollars on cardiac disease every year in the United States, 75% of which is avoidable cardiac disease. And it's still number one cause of death in the United States of men and women alike. They don't have a healthcare system. They don't spend a dime on it, and they don't have heart disease. So I found that deeply, deeply inspiring.
That's a beautiful story. Thank you for painting the picture. Almost felt like we were there with you.
Yeah.
We just had a leadership forum at this conference where we were exploring futures thinking, and we were looking at the overlap of health and life. Like you said, health isn't just this, thing that people think about all the time. It's really about helping people to live their most vibrant lives. And if they are, they're going to be healthier by nature. So trying to figure out how to design the systems that affect our lives such that health is the default as opposed to sickness. It's really a beautiful aspiration for us. And you know, in your documentary, you sort of look at the other side of things, right? Which is the declining life expectancy in the United States. Your documentary is One Nation Under Stress, and you were looking at deaths of despair, which includes suicide, overdose, liver disease. And right now we're all dealing with a lot of stress to varying degrees, but stress is a big deal right now with the pandemic. I wonder, there's so much advice out there, but what should we all be doing to manage stress? What do you do to deal with stress?
Well, thank you for mentioning the HBO doc. That was a labor of love, and I wanted to really do it because I couldn't believe, and this was a few years ago now. I couldn't believe at that time, as you point out correctly, that if you looked at every developed nation in the world since World War II, every single one, and you looked at the populations of people within these developed nations, all of them had increased in life expectancy. They all just kept going up in life expectancy except for one. And the only population that was not increasing in life expectancy was the white working class in the United States. And which was just, it was kind of alarming. I think even the economists who first found this, they saw these trends, they were calculating all this data, they couldn't believe it. They had to keep reworking the numbers. How could it be, in a country like the United States with all the resources we have, that the metric by which we measure ourselves, the metric by which we will be measured hundreds of years from now, we're going in the wrong direction. How could that be? And the top three causes of premature death were suicide, death by suicide, accidental drug overdose, typically opioids, and liver cirrhosis, typically due to alcoholism. And that's why they were called the deaths of despair. And it's a very long discussion to try and figure out why the United States in particular was so affected by this, what was happening in the world at that time, what was happening in the economy, what was happening with immigration, all these different things. All of that played a role. But I think when it came down to the idea of stress overall, which is what the focus of the documentary film really was, I spent so much time talking to stress researchers, isolation researchers, loneliness researchers, and there are all these themes that started to emerge. One of the big ones, I think, is that I think there's always a tendency to say stress is bad. I want to obviate stress from my life. And we know that that's not the answer. We need stress. That's what gets us out of bed in the morning. That what makes somebody study for an exam, prepare for an interview, whatever it might be. There's a great book, if you haven't read it, called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And it's written by Robert Sapolsky. And it's worth reading if you're interested in this topic. But basically, it's this idea that we need stress. An animal has stress because it can outrun a potential predator in the forest or the jungle. We humans need that stress as well. The difference is for the animal, as soon as the threat is gone, they're back to grazing and back to their normal life. For humans, we have had a hard time turning it off. We're bombarded by it now. A lot of it's self-inflicted by the constant inflow of information, the devices, all these sorts of things. So just to set the table in terms of what the goal is, I don't think saying, hey, I want to get rid of stress in my life, that is not a reasonable goal, and it's probably not going to be very productive for you. But the real goal, I think, as you're alluding to, Amy, is to find the periods of time where you can really come down off of the stress. Take it while it's there, nurture it, harness it, use it to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish in your life. But then when you're not actively, requiring those stress hormones, let the stress come down. And the way to do that, I think, is different for everybody. I personally, and I will say this: don't stress about stress, if that makes sense. Don't stress about it, because that just compounds the problem. And I say that because I started meditating about 12 years ago now, back in 2009 and 2008, and I really had a hard time with it. I didn't feel like I was actually benefiting from the meditation. I couldn't clear my mind. I just was having a hard time doing it. And I had this amazing opportunity, which I know is going to sound like I'm name dropping right now. I'm not, but I had a chance to go meditate with the Dalai Lama. I was in Mungad, India, south of India, where he was doing some of his teachings, and he invited me to come meditate with him. He meditates from 3:30 to 6:30 every morning, takes an hour then to get ready for his day, shower, eat some breakfast. And then from 7:30 till, right before 9, when he starts his public day, he meditates more. So he's meditating for 4 hours a day. and for me to do this, I thought this is like a junior baseball player going to play with Mickey Mantle. I'm a little league guy, and I was already knowing that I wasn't that good at this. And so I was trying, and I'll never forget, I looked at him at one point, and he kind of opened his eyes and he looked at me, and he's got this very deep voice, if you've heard him speak, and he's like, you're having difficulty with meditation? And I said, yeah, yes, as a matter of fact, I am. And he said, me too. This person who's been meditating essentially his whole life. I mean, when you're Dalai Lama, you're chosen to be the Dalai Lama, and that's your life from the time you're a child. And yet he still have difficulty, but he focused on something known as analytical meditation. Any of these topics you raise, Amy, I feel like I could speak an hour on any of them, but I'll make it short. There's a thing called analytical meditation. And I wrote a paper on it. If you want, Google it, look it up. But it's this idea, instead of trying to clear your mind, to embrace what it is that's actually on your mind. Maybe it's a problem. Maybe it's something you've just read or something you're trying to deal with. And really visualizing it, really leaning into it, as opposed to sort of casting it off to a corner of your mind and putting it in a thought bubble even. And then letting that bubble sort of rise in front of you. And the significance of that is that as it rises, it tends to detach itself from emotional attachments. His belief is that so many of the decisions we make that we may regret later on or don't think are necessarily the right decision at the time are because of the emotional attachments to them. How to really look at a problem analytically, spin it around the thought bubble. You do this, and two things happen. One is that it is actually very meditative, to just sit there and be inside your own head, not have a distraction, not be thinking about other things, just think about this one thing. There's a lot of joy in just being able to think about one thing for a while. but then to solve the issue or the dilemma or whatever it is that you're trying to address can be helpful to your life. So it is something that I practice on a daily basis now, and I have found it to be quite helpful. I mean, this has been a really hard year for everybody. I think analytical meditation has helped me get through it.
I love it. You're inspiring me because I've really worked on my self care routine, and meditation still eludes me. I can't kind of stop my brain. So I'm going to look into that. Thank you for that. And you do have this quote, which I adore, and it's, "In order to best care for ourselves, we have to also care for each other." And, in this past year where stress has been an issue and there has been even more loneliness and even more isolation than usual, that quote reminds me about, the things that you also say about joy and gratitude and relationships and social connection, and how all of these things affect our health and are tied into our health. What do you think about that?
I'll tell you this: when I wrote that, I knew people may interpret that as sort of a euphemistic thing to say, right? Because it's true. It's not that it isn't true, but yes, of course, you want to be a good citizen and a good human being and take care of people around you, and that part of it's true. But where I arrived when getting to that part of the book was, it was almost more of a physiological sort of learning that I had gone through. And again, talking to all these researchers, there is this concept which many of these neuroscientists will often use called reciprocal altruism. Reciprocal altruism. And it kind of means exactly what it sounds like. It's like this idea of reciprocating the altruistic behaviors. But what is fascinating about it is that if you think about human beings, and frankly, most living things, how they survive and thrive, it is more Darwinian in a way, this idea that, there's a survival of the fittest, which, by the way, isn't something Darwin ever said, but that's sort of the idea, survival of the fittest. You must compete for resources and do these sorts of things. And yet somehow with human beings in particular, it is now widely accepted that in order to survive and thrive as a species, we needed to care for each other. We needed to actually take care of each other. But perhaps what is most surprising is at some point along the way, it became encoded in our DNA that when you do something good for somebody else, it feels good. I think anybody here who's listening has had that feeling before. You do something nice for somebody else in a non-transactional way. You're not asking for anything in return, and it feels good. Now, why would that be? Why would it be that I would give away some of my resources to somebody else, something that is for me, and it feels good to do that? How did that get encoded into our DNA and the way that we feel about things? I don't know. But I think the reason that it happened is because that is how we survived and thrived as a species. We were programmed to take care of each other. So if we lean away from that, we're leaning away from our fundamental biology, and we're leaning away from something that has helped us as a species. If we lean into it, it helps the human race, and it feels good. I mean, how can you ask for more than that? I know a certain segment of the population, and I still know that whether in the book or even in a talk like this, we'll say, well, that sounds good. That sounds like a euphemistic thing. But think about it. Think about it for a little bit. Read about this concept of reciprocal altruism. And you know what? It's a guiding light for me. You want twofers in life where it feels good to do good? That's it. You got it right there.
Oh my goodness, I love it so much. It's truly an inspiration, and I think that's a great note to close on. Thank you so much, Sanjay, for joining us today and all of the work you do to improve health. I know that you've affected millions of people through your work, and just a big kudos to you. So thank you so much, and I hope you'll accept my air hug.
You got it. Here's the air hug back. And like I said, sincerely, I hope I didn't talk your ear off. I was really, really looking forward to speaking to you, Amy. So thanks so much for having me.
Oh, absolutely. And I look forward to the next time. Thank you again.
You got it. Thank you.
Woo!